Today we're going to cover Machiavelli, the second of our two lectures on Machiavelli. Today we want to look at some specific elements of his text, and then the last question we'll have before we leave is, I want to ask the question, is it reasonable to say that Machiavelli is presenting us with what we might call a political theory? To what degree does he belong in this class? Another way of saying that. I noted last time that the text falls into the so-called speculum literature, the so-called mirror literature, from Speculum Principes, right? Which is this genre of literature, advice literature in the medieval period that lays out sort of the principles of good rule. And the prince clearly follows that model, right? It's an advice given to princes. But we noted that what's truly striking about Machiavelli and what makes it such an interesting and really jarring text is the degree to which it departs from the precepts or basic principles of that Speculum Principes literature, which is that previous efforts tended to locate, or almost always located, the idea of authority and rule within some kind of a moral paradigm, and stress then the role of the ruler as a moral actor in the context then of a divinely constituted universe. A very good example of that, we mentioned John of Salisbury. Another person that I might mention, someone that I look at in my own work, for example, is the remarkable French author Christine de Pizan, known usually just as Christine, who lived at the end of the 14th, beginning of the 15th century. She, for example, wrote a book called The Book of the Body Politic, and one of the principles that she embeds in that, or one of the assumptions that she embeds in that, is that the prince needs to understand himself, the ruler needs to understand himself as leading a Christian nation, and so therefore the Christian duty of the ruler reflects the sort of larger Christian duty of the people who live within it. In a final chapter in her book on the body politic, she considers then the role of the little people, the average person, in the context then of constituting a good regime. And her basic point is that the good Christian subject seeking to live a good Christian life then looks to a good Christian ruler to create or obtain a good Christian outcome. And what is the good Christian outcome? What are Christians seeking to achieve? What was the word we saw last time? Salvation, right? The soteriology of Christianity, which is that ultimately the point is not what we do in this life. The point is how we achieve the rewards of the next life. And so it sort of puts this emphasis on a kind of model of citizenship that's built around achieving divine reward. That could not contrast more starkly with Machiavelli's reading, not only in terms of how princes should behave, and we'll talk about that today in some detail, but also the underlying assumption, namely that Christian rulers of Christian nations are there to guide people towards Christian outcomes. Machiavelli specifically rejects this idea, and I can give you the quote, page 54, in chapter 15. In the chapter entitled, The Things for Which Men, and especially Rulers, Are Praised or Blamed, he writes, "Many have imagined republics and principalities that had never been seen or known to exist." This mirror literature imagines people living in kind of imaginary political circumstances. He continues, "However, how men live is so different from how they should live, that a ruler who does not do what is generally done, but persists in doing what ought to be done, will undermine his power rather than maintain it. People don't behave as they should. Instead, they behave as they want. And this means if we try to align a principle of power around, say, a set of Christian ideas, that we will end up in a failed state, because this is not who people really are." He says, how men live is so different from how they should live. So this idea that Christianity, if you will, or that the Christianitas, the idea of a Christian community, lays out a sort of normative blueprint for how we should lead our lives, is fine, but the point is that most people fail to aspire to or live up to that normative standard. So Machiavelli could not be clearer that he is situating his text inside of what we might call realpolitik, the world as it is, not the world as it should be. And so as he says later on, "I shall therefore set aside what he calls fantasies and instead consider what happens in fact." So he's telling us that we should consume this book as part of the mirror literature, as a sort of rare departure from the larger literature, which is not talking about some kind of ideal condition of rule, but instead rule how it is actually practiced, which may then explain some of the more jarring elements that we find inside the text. So we saw then that Machiavelli is building out this image of politics in the context of A, a world that recognizes people as they are, not people as they should be, and then as an ancillary to that, argues that the principle of rule should not be to create normative citizens, should not be to create the ideal Christian subject, but should simply be to maintain power over people as they then will behave. So the ruler is not there to improve society in any kind of Christian sense. The ruler is there to hold on to his power and to be able to exercise his virtue in such a way as to make that possible. And then secondly, that the ruler therefore must craft policies in such a way as to maximize the potential for holding on to power. And that means having the wisdom, courage, sagacity, skill, cunning, etc. necessary in order to fend off the kinds of things that Fortuna will throw at him in order that they may remain on the throne, right? This is what we looked at then last time in our discussion of Machiavelli. And it's therefore in that context that we see such divided scholarship around Machiavellian thinking. We noted that no less than the great political scientist and theorist Leo Strauss simply considers Machiavelli to be no more than a teacher of evil, encouraging people to commit evil deeds. Whereas we saw at perhaps the other extreme, we saw Cassirer argue that in fact what Machiavelli is doing is actually elevating politics into what he called a new science. In other words, with Machiavelli now for the first time, we have somebody who's considering politics as a scientific enterprise, under which then things like cruelty and the like would be part of understanding politics as it is. So these sort of distinct readings of Machiavelli are then made possible, I think, as a result of how unusual Machiavelli, or how unusual the citing of Machiavelli's arguments are in context. What I'd like to do then today with the time that remains is I want to consider two elements of Machiavelli's text. I want to consider two of the most famous instances of the text, and then turn to this question of, does Machiavelli have a political theory? They're two of the most notorious parts of the book. They are from chapters 8 and 9, in which he considers the nature of cruelty and how it should be exercised by rulers who seek to attain power. And then we're going to turn our attention to perhaps the most famous part of the book, namely, is it better to be feared or loved? I'm sure you've encountered that argument or that aspect of his thought before. So we'll look at that. Let's take a look then first at this question of cruelty, this question of the way in which cruelty should be considered as an instrument of power, or we might even be more provocative and suggest that the capacity to be cruel, Machiavelli argues, is a virtue of rule. But in that sense, then it's important to know how to be cruel, right? So it's not just cruelty for its own sake; it's important to know how to be cruel. He says in chapter 8, which is entitled "Those Who Become Rulers Through Wicked Means," he considers then the nature of cruelty, and he considers two people: Agathocles, who became the king of Syracuse, and Alexander VI, who was the Pope. Let's consider his discussion that we see there. He says in chapter 8, in my edition at page 31, he says, "It cannot be called virtue, it cannot be called virtue to kill one's fellow citizens, to betray one's friends, to be treacherous, merciless, and irreligious. Power may be gained by acting in such ways, but not glory." That it cannot be called virtue to kill one's fellow citizens, to betray one's friends, in other words, to be two-faced, to be treacherous, merciless, and irreligious. Power may be gained, but not glory. We'll see that, in fact, that statement doesn't seem to be very legitimate, because at different points, and we'll come to it in a moment, Machiavelli is telling us that's exactly what you should be doing. That if you want to attain power, you need to cultivate the art of how to kill your fellow citizens, to betray your friends, to be treacherous, to be merciless, and irreligious. And if power is gained by acting in such a way, and the purpose then of being a prince is to attain power, then in fact is perhaps Machiavelli telling us, okay, well that's not virtue, if we might consider it in a sense of as a good character, but it is virtue in the sense of good rule. As a blueprint for attaining power, killing one's fellow citizens, betraying one's friends, being treacherous, being merciless, and being irreligious is, in fact, the toolkit that we should consider as part of a system of power. Yeah.
Well, the fact that he says that it may lead to power, but yet not glory, doesn't it like hint that yeah, sure, you can be powerful, but you will not be able to be loved or successfully rule.
It could be. I mean, part of it is that if you cultivate those elements too much, that in fact it may destabilize your rule because people turn against you. But as we'll see, in fact, Machiavelli's view of people is so demeaning that in fact he doesn't think that that's particularly a problem. So I think one of the things we might say is it sounds like a kind of lip service to, it's important to be, if you want to have glory, you have to be good. But the reality is, in fact, he's more than willing to countenance, more than willing to accept, even codify the need to be all of these things in order for someone to attain power. So that it's a phrase that has bothered many scholars because it seems to directly contradict what he says. If it were easy to say, well, if you kill your fellow citizens and so on, people will hate you and you'll lose power, then what you're saying is correct. It would be a simple linear relationship between bad behavior and bad outcomes. But in fact, elsewhere, Machiavelli tells us that's exactly what you should do. And people won't hate you. That in fact, they will respect you. And he even gives an example late in the text of a ruler who he considers to be unusually treacherous, merciless, and irreligious, who at the same time is held up as a great ruler, no less than the great Fernando of Aragon, Ferdinand the Catholic, who he considers to be a master of the arts of rule, but he considers to have cultivated each of those elements. So how we are to make sense of that is a little bit difficult, but perhaps it's putting the sense of glory is not necessary then for rule, right? If the virtue doesn't lead to glory, maybe our conclusion should be, well, glory is not necessarily what a ruler should be aiming for. A ruler should be aiming for what? Power and survival. The best ruler is the ruler who dies in his own bed of peaceful natural causes, as opposed to being run through with a sword and hung up in the town square, right? This is what you're looking for. He says in the following chapter, he gives the story of Agathocles, and he talks about the story of this struggle around the papacy. And he then says, in conclusion, it may well be wondered how it could happen that Agathocles and others like him, after committing countless treacherous and cruel deeds, could live securely in their own countries for a long time, defend themselves against external enemies, and never be plotted against by their citizens. For many others have not been able to maintain their power by acting cruelly, even in peaceful times, let alone in times of war, which are always uncertain. So in other words, the object lesson of this particular case study is to figure out, well, how can we then analyze or understand how cruelty should be exercised as a tool of power, in order that one may then rule for a long time. And he says that the answer to this is not simply to be cruel, but as he says, I believe that this depends upon whether cruel deeds are committed well or badly. That's an unusual statement, isn't it? Because normally we would say cruel deeds simply are bad. People should not commit cruel deeds. And yet Machiavelli is putting a kind of Aristotelian reading on this. Committing cruelty is an art. You can learn to do it well, and if you don't, you will do it badly. And so therefore it's important to understand how to be cruel, how to commit cruelty. This is why Strauss considered Machiavelli to be a teacher of evil, because he simply accepts that cruelty is part of the necessary arsenal that a ruler must deploy as part of the arts of power. If you're teaching people how to rule, right? If your book is an instruction manual for how to be a good prince, and as part of that instruction manual, you embed as a basic principle the need to act cruelly well, are you not then, as Strauss would argue, a teacher of evil? Let's consider what it means then to practice cruel deeds well or badly. He said, a cruel deed may be called well committed. He says, if one may use the word well of that which is evil, when they are all committed at once, because they are necessary for establishing one's power, and are not afterwards persisted in, but changed for measures as beneficial as possible to one's subjects. Cruel deeds that are committed well are the ones that you do right away, and after that you're like, okay, I'm not going to be cruel anymore. I'll give you an example of this that comes from my own study. The very famous French king, so-called Le Roi l'Araignée, the Spider King of France. French people in the room here? Do you remember who the Spider King of France was? Which Louis? No? Really? Yeah. Shocking what's happened to the standards of French education. Okay, Spanish, over to you. Does anyone want to help the French lady out with her own history? Does anybody know who the Roi Araignée was, the Spider King? Louis the... Louis XI. Louis XI was locked in a struggle with various powerful barons in France, including the Duke of Burgundy, the Duke of Savoy, and the Duke of Normandy. And at the end of the 15th century, when the French state had been severely weakened as a result of the 100 Years' War, and in fact the succession of two very weak French kings, Charles VI and Charles VII, Louis XI took the throne, and being a crafty devil, he turned his back on people who had previously been his allies, and he launched into a military conflict with these different power centers that sort of were at the periphery of France. And when he reconquered, for instance, Normandy, which he did in the 1480s, the very first thing he did was he had punished or executed a whole bunch of people who were associated with the previous Duke of Normandy. So there was a kind of initial burst of violence as part of the French irredentism. That's a good word for you to know. Look at this, all these great words you're learning here. I hope you're using these at the dinner table to show how smart you're becoming. There's the same word in Spanish, right? Irredentismo. What does it mean?
This one you want to get back what you lost?
Exactly. It's the reconquering of previously lost territory. So irredentism means to get back what you've lost. Exactly right. So as a result of after Louis XI's irredentist policies were successful in Normandy, after he executed these people at the beginning, what was the next thing he did? He immediately thereafter issued a blanket amnesty to all those who had been associated with the previous ducal regime. So first he killed a bunch of people or jailed them, and then he forgave them. I think that's a good example of what Machiavelli considers cruelty well committed. That's well committed cruelty. You scare the shit out of people, and then you're nice to them. And so what have you learned from that? You're like, okay, I better not cross this guy, and I'm grateful that he didn't kill me. This is what you get from this. So I think when we see that in saying maybe cruel deeds may be called well committed, when they are all committed at once because they are necessary for establishing one's power, as Louis XI did in Normandy, and are not afterwards persisted in, but changed for measures like an amnesty, as beneficial as possible to one's subjects. What are badly committed cruel deeds then? Badly committed cruel deeds, as he says, are those that at first are few in number, but increase with time rather than diminish. Those who follow the first method can in some measure remedy their standing both with God and with men, as Agathocles did. Those who follow the second cannot possibly maintain their power. The first is a form of cruelty or fear followed by mercy, whereas the second is simply a kind of perpetual terror. And if you have people living under the sort of permanent threat of physical violence, eventually they will rise up. As he says shortly thereafter, the ruler should by his restraint reassure men and win them over by benefiting them. So in other words, after you've gotten rid of your enemies, that's the right moment then for you to show that you're on their side. For injuries should be done altogether so that because they are tasted less, they will cause less resentment. Benefits should be given out one by one so that they will be savored more. That's a very nice line, isn't it? Do we all get that? Injury should be done altogether so that the impact is low, whereas when you're doing favors to people, don't be too generous all at once. You should have a slow release policy of generosity. A little bit of a favor to you, a little bit of a favor to the next person, so that the impact of your generosity is felt more profoundly. Cruelty is well practiced when its impact is minimized. Now, is that a moral position? If we argue that it's necessary to be cruel in order to attain power, as Louis XI would have argued when he retook Normandy, but you only exercise such cruelty as is necessary in order to attain that power, and thereafter you institute policies that are beneficial to people, is that truly the definition of evil? Could we not argue that there is some kind of a greater good that is perhaps being served if the purpose is ultimately to bring benefit to those who are under your authority, and it's necessary therefore to engage in acts of cruelty to attain that? Is that not an example of what we think of as the Machiavellian phrase, the ends justify the means, right? That in fact cruelty simply becomes a mechanism for achieving some kind of greater good? That's the kind of question that Machiavelli, I think, leaves us to ponder.